Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 16th of October, but it's also the week after Ignite. So it's a pretty big update. I would definitely recommend go check out the Book of News. So I'm going to cover some of what was talked about and some other things, but the Ignite Book of News really goes into an overview of everything that was covered at Ignite. But very often it will actually then go and link to a blog, which has more detail, and the blog go and links to documentation, which gives even more detail. So my recommendation would be, hey, if you're interested in maybe things outside of infrastructure, or you're trying to get links for some of the things that I talk about, go and check out the Book of News, which will lead you to blogs, which will lead you to more information. I will try and add chapters as best I can, but there's so many, it's going to be pretty broad. I was on vacation, so I didn't do any new videos last week, just last week's update, because I was doing the Ironman and I did finish. It took me 14 and a half hours. I was actually a bit under the weather. You might be able to tell I'm kind of sick now, so I wasn't actually feeling that great. But I did finish, and it was an amazing experience. There's me and my little finisher medal. Going to make that a bit easier to see over there. So that was really cool. And no, it was a great overall experience to really kind of get that done. But now normal service will be resumed. Okay, so on with the updates. So starting with compute, there were new AKS hybrid options. So we think about Arc Managed. Remember, Azure Arc is all about extending that Azure control plane to other clouds, to on-premises. And then when I extend that control plane, well, we get aspects of just Azure capabilities in terms of governance and security and tagging and a whole bunch of capabilities, but then bring other services, some of it's Defender, for example, policy. Well, once I'm Arc Managed, I can now bring this AKS hybrid. And we're used to the idea of bringing AKS if it's Azure Stack HCI, which is, remember, the on-premises hyper-converged hypervisor solution, and also if I'm running Windows Server. Well, now what I can do is I can also bring that AKS if I'm Arc Managed Windows 10, 11, Windows IoT. So think a much, much lighter Kubernetes environment. And also I can put a lot of controls over the amount of resource, the CPU, the memory, the storage for that AKS environment to make sure, hey, that container-based workload doesn't interfere with the regular applications that may be running on that Windows client device. And of course, once we have this AKS, I get the familiar Azure portal, ARM templates, the Azure CLI. I can then deploy things like Defender. I can use GitOps v2, so I can get consistent deployment to things in Azure AKS, but then also the Arc Managed, those hybrid AKS environments. So I get consistency. I can have things like the open service mesh. I can integrate with Azure Key Vault. It's using Mariner version 2.0 for the Linux, which is about half the size of the previous version. There were security improvements. So a whole bunch of really nice things about those hybrid options. So if I'm testing, for example, hey, I could maybe go and do some testing in one environment and then deploy it out into the hybrid environment. Maybe I've got some IoT type device where I want some kind of service there. So I get a very consistent experience. For Azure Kubernetes Service, I can now have 500 node clusters. So it's going to be over multiple node pools. I think the default is still 1,000, but I can up it to 5,000 now if I want to. There were other announcements around AKS, but we've spoken about them in previous weeks. For example, the Azure CNI overlay. They talked about it at Ignite. That's where now I can have a separate IP space for the pods from that of the nodes themselves. And I actually did a whole video on that. That's very different from KubeNet in implementation. It feels like KubeNet, but it's not using route tables, so I don't get the limitations, those route tables, the delays that those would introduce. Also, things like AKS notifications via Event Grid for things like new Kubernetes versions being available. I can have ARM-based nodes for my AKS is now GA. So that's very good from a cost perspective. I can have confidential compute, the AMD-based ones, which are whole VM encryption. They're available now in GA. And of course, the Azure AD workload identity, which really simplifies and standardizes using OIDC giving identities to the pods directly. So a whole set of nice features around AKS. And they talked about Azure Kubernetes Fleet Manager. So I may have multiple AKS clusters. This could be because I have different regions, I have different environments, whatever the reason. What Fleet Manager is going to let me do is take a set of AKS clusters and really manage them as one. Now the functionality is going to increase over time, but today it's really focused on two things. One is configuration. So I can have configuration propagation to all of the AKS clusters I put in a fleet. So the idea is I create a fleet resource, then I add AKS clusters into that fleet resource so they become member clusters of that particular fleet. And I might have multiple fleets. Then at the fleet level, I can define configuration that will propagate down to the AKS clusters. And I can also now have cross-cluster load balancing. Now I have to be using Azure CNI, but now I can define a load balancer at my fleet level, and it could now have pods from different AKS clusters as part of its backend. So they're the two features it's doing today, but more features are coming. So that's in preview if you have that sort of multi-AKS environment. Arc-enabled VM management preview 2. So this is all about the idea of taking a further step when I think about my Arc-enabled resources. So now what I can do for this with my Azure Stack HCI, remember that on-premises hyperconverged that's being managed by Arc, I can now, through the regular Azure means, go and say I want to actually create VMs. So think VM lifecycle. So now I can go and create those virtual machines. And what's added in this preview 2 is I now have support for custom images. I have support for a whole bunch of different VM extensions, including things like the custom script extension. So I can do a lot more as part of that now VM provisioning. VMSS Flex. So if I think about virtual machine scale sets, we're used to the uniform orchestration mode, where I have one template, one configuration that, hey, I can do auto scale if I want. And then there's Flex, which I can add VMs into that. I can mix spot and non-spot. I can add different VM SKUs. I can add different images, but then I get the benefit of orchestration across patches around extension upgrades, about AZ distribution, improvements in actual provisioning performance. But even with Flex, I do still have the option to have this concept of a certain image I want to use. So even with Flex, I can still have that option, say, hey, I want some image-based deployment automatically of a certain scale. So I can create a profile. Well, what I can do with that profile now is in that profile, I can specify I want a certain mix of non-spot, so standard VMs, and spot VMs. Remember, spot VMs are great because, hey, Azure has all this spare capacity. And rather than it being idle, they say, hey, you can tell me a price up to which you want to pay. And if it goes beyond that price, or maybe just a pay-as-you-go needs it, we'll turn it off. But if I can use the spot to save cost, fantastic. But what if all my spot got turned off? Well, I still need to make sure maybe my service is running. So what I can now do is I can specify a certain mix of standard and spot. And I can say, hey, look, if the spot gets dropped, we'll bring standard up to make sure I'm still offering my service. I can set a goal percentage of spot and non-spot. And it's going to go and spin those up and maintain those for me to keep the required levels of performance, but also try and keep that as cost optimized as possible. So that's a really great feature. Azure VMware solution now has stretched clusters going across availability zones. If I use that, I can now get 4 nines. So that is out in preview. And also for AVS, I can have customer managed key. So if I think about that virtual SAN for the storage, I can now have a key that I manage, I roll over as actually part of that. Excuse me, told you I was sick. Confidential VM guest attestation has gone GA. So if I'm using confidential compute, for example, the whole VM encryption with AMD, my application may want to know, am I really running on that confidential compute? Is it in good health? And so what the application can do is it can now query inside that guest VM a certain library and get a response back that will attest through integration with the Azure services through the hardware on the fact that yes, you are running on confidential compute and yes, it's in a good state. I can also now use confidential compute on SQL VMs. I can use it on Azure Virtual Desktop, and I mentioned that sort of AKS as well. On the networking side, so the private DNS resolver has gone GA. I've done a whole video about this before, but there's really two use cases for this. Obviously, Azure has private DNS zones, and I link those to a virtual network. Well, to get the records from that, I have to integrate to the Azure DNS endpoint that's only available within an Azure virtual network. Well, what if I want to get a return of a record from another network, maybe on premises? There's no way to talk to that IP directly from outside of a VNet. So in the past, I'd have to put in some kind of DNS forwarder in the VNet that I would talk to that would then go and look up and return. So the private DNS resolver does that for me. It exposes an inbound endpoint that I can forward requests to that will then go and talk to the Azure private DNS zones and return the records. And it can do an outbound endpoint. So from within the virtual network, I can conditional forward certain zones to DNS servers outside or on just custom DNS servers. So it has both of those capabilities. So that's now GA. I now have static IPs for private endpoints. So if I don't want to kind of be at the mercy of the dynamic IP allocation that we normally get with a subnet, maybe I want to delete the private endpoint and recreate it. I want to make sure I get the same IP. I can do that now. And also the network interface cards we get with the private endpoint, I can now have custom names. So maybe I don't want that GUID part as part of the standard name. Now for the Azure Distributed Denial of Service offering, we have the basic, which is free, that does a certain level of really very large scale defense. But then before we had the standard offering, which I would buy the plan, it would cover, I think, 100 IPs and I could pay an overage. I would then link it to virtual networks and it would cover all the public IPs on that virtual network. But it's a pretty big plan. So if I'm a small company with maybe just one or two public IPs, it really didn't financially make sense for me. So what they've actually done now is the standard Azure DDoS has been renamed to Network Protection and is still available and it still has all the features. But now I can also buy this IP-based protection. So it's aimed at the small, medium customers. And as the name suggests, I can now enable it and pay for it on a per public IP basis. It's missing a few of the features of the network protection-based offering. I think really it's around sort of some of the critical response capabilities, some of the financially backed SLA things. But pretty much everything else it has. So that's going to be great if I am a smaller scale, but would still like that more customized DDoS protection. On the storage side, so the Azure Elastic SAN is now available in preview. If you think about coming from on-premises where I have a storage area network that is made up of volumes that are part of volume sets that are part of the SAN, I get these massive amounts of IOPS, massive throughput. I'd normally talk to it through things like iSCSI. Well, now Azure Elastic SAN will let me take that methodology and just bring that to Azure. So what Azure Elastic SAN is doing is using Azure storage on the back end, but it's striping across to give me huge amounts of throughput, huge amounts of IOPS. They talked about millions of IOPS, double-digit gigabytes per second. It's low single-digit latency. It can be LRS or ZRS. So ZRS, I've got resiliency across availability zones. And it's going to expose iSCSI. So I'm going to go and talk to an iSCSI target from my VM. So it's going to go over my network path. And I can now get this huge amount of performance. But I'm using those familiar concepts of creating a volume that's part of a volume set that's within this new Elastic SAN. Premium SS2 V2 has gone GA. Again, I did a video on this. This really is similar to UltraDisk. So if I think about the old premium SSD, the IOPS and the throughput scaled pretty linearly as the capacity went up. There were bursting capabilities, there were things you could do. But what happens with premium SSD V2, there's no SKUs anymore. I just size it, I have a certain capacity, and then based on that capacity, it has a maximum IOPS and throughput but I can pick the value I actually want. So I only pay for the performance I need, and I can dynamically change that as ever is required. The difference from UltraDisk has higher IOPS and throughput, and it has a lower latency. I think with SSD v2, we think sub-millisecond. With Ultra, it's sub half a millisecond. So that's really the big difference between those. Huge number of updates on the database side. So now we have PostgreSQL for CosmosDB. That's GA. This is really a rebranding of the Postgres hyperscale offering that we previously had. So now it's this PostgreSQL for CosmosDB. It's still the Citus extension, so I still get this huge scale, these distributed tables. I can start with a single node, then move to multiple nodes. I can have optional high availability with standby nodes. I can replicate to multiple regions for read workloads. The apps just integrate as if it's a normal Postgres. And that's really what this is. There's a great extension for easy ingestion from Blob, but this is really that evolution of the various Postgres offerings we have in Azure. CosmosDB MongoDB now has 16 megabyte documents, up from 2 megabytes. And also now the data plane operations can have fine-grained access control. So I can create roles that have one or more privileges. Now, this RBAC is not using Azure AD accounts. These are still local accounts as part of that MongoDB database, but now it's in line with what I would natively get with MongoDB. PostgreSQL and MySQL Flexible. Remember, Flexible is the go-forward single instance offerings for the managed databases from the old single server, which were more a special kind of container-based technology. Flexible offerings are VM-based. I can have high availability, stop-start, burstable, great configuration capabilities. Well, customer managed key is now in preview. So a customer, hey, in my key vault, I can manage the key used for encryption. I can control that rollover and everything else. Also, for both of those, we now have Azure AD-based authentication. So the credentials I'm going to use to now talk to it are stored in Azure AD, and they can be given roles on both the Postgres and MySQL. This includes things like managed identity. So this is really powerful. If I have other applications running in Azure that use managed identity, I don't have to worry about storing credentials or anything else. I can have an Azure AD-based administrator, which has all the same permissions as the native PostgreSQL or MySQL admin. And I have to use that Azure AD-based admin to then go and configure other Azure AD-based authentication and roles within those databases. PostgreSQL Flexible now has geo-redundant backup restore. And this is paired regions only today. So the primary server is replicated to the paired region where it can be restored. Now this does include a fast restore option. The way the protection works is obviously there's the snapshots, the recovery points, and then logs. So what a fast restore does is it creates a new server instance and restores a full snapshot backup that I pick. Well, because it's a full, there are no logs that I have to replay. There's no recovery of those logs involved. So it's a very, very fast to get up and running. MySQL Flexible now has auto-scale I/O, so IOPS is in preview. And basically the point of this is I'm only going to pay for the IOPS I require. It can dynamically scale up and down based on the workload, so I'm not wasting money. MySQL Flexible HA now has in-region replicas, so I can have up to 10 read-only servers. So if I do have those read-only workloads, instead of them hitting my primary server, I can go and take one of these read replicas, maybe for analysis, any kind of sort of batching process. I can run and take that stress off of my primary server. So that's now available for HA-enabled servers as well, not just the non-HA servers. I now have major version upgrade, and I know we've talked about this in previous weeks, but I talked about it at Ignite, for example, 5.7 to 8. There is downtime. The downtime is going to depend on the database instance size, the number of tables, the provision storage, so the storage performance of the database. But now it is a single click, and it will go and do that for you. There's now a database migration assessment for Oracle. So this is really an Azure Data Studio extension. It's going to use the Azure Database Migration Service. So it's going to look at the Oracle database. And it's going to look at it in multiple ways. One, sure, the performance. What does it actually need in terms of the throughput, the types of capabilities, and it can get that performance based on perf data or an AWR report. But it's also going to go and look at things like, well, hey, what's the workload complexity? Looking at the schema. So then what remediation is likely to be required both on the application, what are hours going to be required for code assessments and things like that. So it's going to give you a lot of good information to help think about, okay, well, how could I actually use and do a migration from Oracle? And Azure Data Explorer has some new ingestion. Again, we've talked about these. Amazon S3, Synapse Link, CosmosDB, OpenTelemetry. So there are those standards around the metrics, the logs, the traces I might have, Azure Stream Analytics, and the Telegraph agent streaming. And then Arc-enabled SQL. And so this is, hey, I'm thinking, I have SQL servers, they're outside of Azure, but I'm extending that Arc management. Well, now I can have single sign-on, so it can integrate with Azure AD to manage through all the same portals, the same experience I'm used to. And I can have those Defender assessments. So from a security and just the overall help from posture of those, I can now have that. Miscellaneous. So Azure Automanage has a number of updates. So Automanage is all about, hey, those Azure VMs or those Arc-enabled servers. Yes, it's an OS instance, but I'm trying to take most of the burden of managing the OS off of myself. How can I make the platform do it? So what they've now done is they've done a number of enhancements through key areas. So again, Automanage is thinking about the backup, the configuration, the anti-malware protection, all of those different things. So now we have things like enhanced backup settings via custom configuration profiles. I can have different auditing modes. I can specify a custom log analytics workspace. I can have custom tags, which is really useful if I'm doing tag-based governance. It now supports Windows 10 and Windows 11 virtual machines. Previously, it was only Windows Server and Linux server environments. It can enable Microsoft anti-malware. So a whole bunch of updates around Automanage. Azure Monitor has a whole set of updates. So the predictive auto scale for virtual machine scale sets has gone GA. VMSS has auto scale. And I can create rules to say, hey, the CPU averages above 80%, we'll go and add 2 instances. But if you think about that logic, okay, I've hit 80% or more, go and add 2 instances. Well, that takes time. It takes time to provision the new VMs, takes time maybe for things to start inside and start getting the traffic. So there's a delay in its effectiveness, and in that gap, well, maybe I'm impacting performance. So what the predictive does is it looks at the history and will now do the auto scale in advance based on that history and create the new instances before that CPU peak comes, so I never impact the performance. So that's gone GA. Basic logs and archive logs for log analytics workspaces has gone GA. So normally we have analytical logs. They're fantastic, very powerful KQL against them, and retention kind of up to 2 years, but it costs a certain amount of money. Basic logs are cheaper, but I only have a subset of KQL available to them. It's an 8-day fixed time there. I can't do cross-table, for example, KQL, but it's really useful for many types of logs. So hey, if I can use basic, I'm going to save a lot of money. Then archive logs, super cheap storage, but I can't run KQL against it directly. I have to run a search job or restore job, which then brings it into analytical logs. So I have those options now available to try and optimize, hey, how am I spending my money in that log analytics? There's table level role-based access control for standard and custom tables. And that's not just, hey, at a table level I do or don't have access. That includes things like, hey, you only have read-only access, things like that. Azure Monitor Agent, the agent migration tool has gone GA. So hey, I'm using the old log analytics agent. I want to move to the Azure Monitor Agent. That migration tool and that process has gone GA. Also now, Azure Monitor Agent for Windows 10 and 11 has gone GA. There's now AKS recommended alert rules. and there's a Prometheus managed service. So what this does, Prometheus is really the de facto, the standard monitoring for container-based workloads. So what I can do with this Prometheus managed service is it's using Azure Monitor, and it's going to use the standard ingress point for that time series Azure Monitor metrics database, but then it also exposes a Prometheus query endpoint, so I can use things like PromQL. But it's going to just light that up as a managed offering, so all of the HA, the scaling, the data retention is just native to this new managed Prometheus offering. Windows Admin Center in the portal has gone GA. So Windows Admin Center is this fantastic interface for managing Windows Server. Now it's just there in the Azure portal, and we just integrate in with all my workloads. The Azure Hybrid Benefit has been expanded. So Azure Hybrid Benefit is all about, hey, I have a certain Windows Server or SQL Server license that's covered by SA, and hey, I can then reduce my licensing costs on things like VMs in Azure. We're extending that benefit, so also now it will cover things like AKS using Windows Server node pools, and also Azure Stack HCI will now be free if I've got the right sort of data center licensing covered by Hybrid Benefits. They're really expanding that, and there's a portion of time I can have that dual use while I'm doing migrations from my current to that end state. Azure Savings Plan for Compute. So many people are used to the idea of reserved instance. Reserved instance lets me say, hey, for this very specific SKU in this region, I'm going to commit to use this amount per hour for 1 or 3 years. And I get a big discount on that. Now, if I use less than that, I still pay that amount I've committed to. If I use more, well, the amount above, I pay the regular pay-as-you-go rate. So it's up to that line, I get that nice reduction based on that commitment price. But it's very specific. It's very specific SKU. It's very specific region. There is some current ability to exchange for different SKUs. But what the Azure Savings Plan does is it's far broader. It's not region specific. It's all regions. It covers a huge amount of different compute services. So if I think about nearly all of the VM SKUs, dedicated hosts, Azure Container Interfaces, Functions Premium Plan, App Service Premium V3, Isolated V2, covers all of that. So now I say, hey, I'm going to spend $10 an hour in my Azure Savings Plan. I don't have to be any more specific. So as long as I'm spending that $10 for 1 or 3 years, it discounts up to that $10 an hour for the infrastructure part of that charge. If I go above it, well, then I pay regular pay as you go. If I don't spend $10 an hour on compute services of any of those types, and I can change, hey, it's a VM this hour, then it's a ACI, then whatever, it doesn't care. If I spend less though, then I still pay that set amount. But it's far, far more flexible than the old reserved instance. I still have reserved instances, they're not going away, but this is a far more flexible. Now, the percentage discount is slightly less, but that flexibility and the fact that I can use, hey, different regions or different compute SKUs is probably going to be more attractive to most customers. So this, I think, is going to be the sort of hero SKU, and I'll do a more detailed video on this. Defender for DevOps, Cloud Security Posture Management. So Defender for DevOps, other announcements was GitHub Advanced Security is now available for Azure DevOps. So looking for secrets, the code QL to find insecure code, that now applies to Azure DevOps as well. I can purchase for that as well. But also Defender for DevOps will go and search for my pipelines, my Azure DevOps, my GitHub environments, help visualize and show me my security posture. And then the Cloud Security Posture Management builds on all the other solutions to provide this risk-based information to my security teams, gives me analysis of attack paths, what are the most exploitable resources, and it's cross-cloud. So other clouds, hybrid, brings all of that to me. There's also a new Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. So this is really the successor to the Azure Security Benchmark. And this really covers all of the fundamental cloud security principles. It gives me detailed guidance. And again, that's cross-cloud. So there's this new benchmark. Azure Backup had a whole bunch of updates. There's an enhanced soft delete. So what that basically lets me do is now you can't disable it. So if a malicious actor came in, they're going to try and disable my backups, delete my soft delete items. They can't until it's hit the expiry time. Multi-user authorization lets me have that separate resource guard that to perform any type of action that could be high privileged, I have to get permission on the resource guard, which can be in a different tenant even, so different sub, different tenant, which again helps mitigate what a bad actor could do if they managed to get in. They couldn't go and disable my backup protection. They couldn't go and delete my vaults. That completely isolated resource guard, I have to get access to that. And immutable backup vaults. Hey, once I've configured a recovery point, it cannot be deleted until it reaches that intended expiry time. So a whole set of features around Azure Backup as well, all in preview. And that was it. So a lot of updates, sorry, and my voice is a bit thing, but hopefully that helped. Again, go and check out the book of news. There's a huge amount of information on there. But until the next update and next video, take care.